a popular Gemara. Usually a boy will start studying it either in grade 6, 7, or 8, or in high school, and then they may study it again when they go to yeshiva. Um, it has a certain popularity because of conceptually it's very stimulating and challenging, the laws of returning lost objects. And also, perhaps a bit of the reason is because it teaches proper moral and ethical conduct. That if you find something, a lost item, you should feel a moral obligation to return it under certain conditions. But I think that that when you study this Gemara, it becomes somewhat confusing, but at the same time very mind challenging. And if you're trying to cultivate the mind of a young man, then this is a good chapter to get started with. We're not going to go into all of the technical, very difficult concepts that are found in Elu Mitzios. We're just going to cut to the chase and get to the halacha. But in order for us to be able to cut to the chase, we're going to need to learn some new terminology that is unique to the laws of Hashavas Aveda, of returning lost objects. So the first thing that we're going to look at today is to look at the three psukim that I mentioned to you. Let me just share that. Okay, so it's from Sepharia. Does everyone see the psukim on the screen? Okay.
Yes.
So the Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 22, which is Parshas Kitetse, Lo sir'eh es shor achicha o es seyoni dachim. You shall not see the ox of your brother or his sheep gone astray, v'hisalamta mehem, and you hide from them or ignore them. In other words, if you happen to notice them wandering on the street, in those days it would be your friend's ox or your friend's sheep. Today it might be your friend's dog, certainly not his coyote. But if you see a wandering coyote, you stay away. But if you see your friend's dog, and your friend lives in Thornhill and you happen to run into the dog somewhere in a different neighborhood, then that would be a comparable situation where the dog is wandering and you can tell the dog is lost. You do not have a right to ignore it or to hide yourself from the situation. Hashev tishivem le'achicha, but rather you must return it back to your brother. That's literally what the pasuk means. Pasuk number 2. V'im lo karov achicha elecha v'lo yedata. But if your brother is not close to you, or you do not know him, you don't know, it belongs to your brother, but you don't know who the guy is. So, va'asafto el toch beisecha, then you shall bring the lost animal or the lost object into your house. V'haya imecha, it shall be with you, ad derosh achicha oso, until your brother seeks it out, and then v'hashevo solo, and then you shall return it to him. So, the Torah gives you a nondescript amount of time that you have to keep it with you until your brother seeks the lost object. The Torah doesn't detail how your brother is going to seek it and how you're going to connect with each other, but the Torah is basically placing the onus on the finder to be patient, to hold on to it, and the Torah also doesn't tell you what your obligations are as far as the financial expense of feeding the animal. Like what happens if the actual cost of feeding the animal exceeds the value of the animal over the course of a year or 2 years? Torah doesn't address that issue, and that's of course one of the issues that's undertaken by the Gemara. And then the third and final pasuk. V'chein ta'aseh lachamoro, so shall you do for his donkey. V'chein ta'aseh lisim laso, so shall you do for his garment. So here the Torah introduces inanimate objects as well. V'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedas achicha, so shall you do for any lost item of your brother, asher tovad mimenu umitzasa, if it is lost from him and you find it. Lo suchal lihis alei. And once again, the Torah says you do not have a right to ignore it or to hide from the situation. That's the end of the laws of Hashavas Aveda, which is introduced once and only once in the entire Torah. Okay? And that's the subject of our entire chapter. Now, just a couple of concepts before we actually begin the halacha. So now that we have that, so let me just do another share screen, and we'll get to the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch. The other term that we need to know is, so the first term we need to know is the word aveda, which is a lost object. Now, a lost object occupies a very interesting status in halacha. If I own something, I own a widget. The widget belongs to me, even if it's not in my possession, because once it's mine, it's mine. Is there a way for a person to relinquish ownership of an object in halacha? The answer is yes. You can declare something to be ownerless. And there's another way to relinquish ownership of something. You can give it as a gift to somebody else, for example. And here's another way to relinquish ownership. If the object is in a public domain and you give up any hope of ever retrieving the object, that's also a method of relinquishing ownership of the object. So you need two things. Number one, it's in a public domain, it's in a public area. And number two, you give up hope of ever retrieving it. And essentially you're mentally relinquishing ownership of it and saying basically it's no longer mine, it's Hefker, because I'm never going to get it back again. Once an object is ownerless, there's no longer a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. Okay? So there's only a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda if the owner still wants his object or is not aware that it's lost. But if he's aware that it's lost, then you can ascertain that he's already relinquished ownership by giving up hope of ever retrieving it. So then you no longer have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, just like you don't have a mitzvah to return something to something to you don't have, there's no mitzvah to return an object to an owner of an ownerless object if there is no owner. Okay, so this idea of relinquishing ownership mentally is called Yeush, Yud Aleph Vav Shin, and it is the subject of a vast majority of that chapter called Elu Mitzios that I mentioned to you in the Gemara. There's only one further level of complication in this discussion of Yeush, of mentally sort of giving up hope of ever retrieving the object. What would be the law if someone loses an object and they're not aware that it's lost? They don't know. It fell off the back of their truck. Okay, it fell out of their pocket and they haven't yet discovered the loss. So there's a whole debate in the Gemara whether that is considered to be still in the possession of the owner, or based on the circumstances of the fact that this object would be considered irretrievable to the owner had he known that it was lost, he would give up hope. So at that point, is that considered to be ownerless or not? We paskin that it's not considered ownerless, that until he discovers that it's lost, it's considered still to be in the possession of the original owner. And therefore I have an obligation to return that object, even if, were he to discover its loss, he would have given up hope. Now, when does a person give up hope of ever retrieving an object? If a wallet falls out of my pocket, am I going to retrieve hope of ever getting it back? I actually once lost my passport in Pearson Airport. I wasn't even aware that it was lost. But my thinking would have been, had I lost my passport, maybe a good Samaritan will give it back to one of the authorities in Pearson, and I'll get it back. And as a matter of fact, when I got home, I got a phone call from someone in Pearson Airport. Is this Daniel Karapkin? I said, yes. We have your passport. You need to come and pick it up. And I was very grateful, right? Now, why is it that my passport is something that I would never give up hope of retrieving? One simple reason. It has my name in it. It's clearly identifiable as belonging to a person. It has value, and it belongs to a person because it has their name on it. So in halacha, that's called a siman. A siman is that it has an identifiable sign that it belongs to an individual, and that individual is capable of identifying it and letting the finder know what its unique symbols are, what its unique characteristics are, its features. But let's say, and the same thing would be true if I lose a wallet. My wallet has my driver's license. It has a number of other different IDs in it that clearly identify it with being mine. So while it's true that not necessarily every person is a good Samaritan, but still, I may not give up hope of ever retrieving it, because it's got my name, and hopefully a good Samaritan will find it. But let's say I lose $100 bill. $100 bill falls out of my pocket. There's no real identifiable sign that $100 bill is mine. And as such, there's a greater likelihood that a person will be miyaesh, that he will give up hope of ever retrieving that object. So, in a situation where I, as a finder, am walking down the street and come across $100 bill, is there a certain reasonableness that I can assume that whoever lost this $100 bill has already been miyaesh, has already given up hope? So that's a bit of a gray area in halacha, because if he's already given up hope, then this $100 bill is ownerless, and I'm allowed to keep it. If the $100 bill is unknown, it's the person who lost it doesn't yet know that he lost the $100 bill because it fell out of his pocket just a few minutes ago, and it's like in a busy thoroughfare in a shopping center or something like that. So then it's possible that even though I cannot identify the owner, I still have an obligation of hashavas aveda, and I'm sort of stuck, because once I pick it up and it's still considered to be in the possession of the original owner, I may be guilty of theft by holding on to the $100 bill. So that's something that we have to explore. Another area that has to be explored, of course, we mentioned, finding something in a busy thoroughfare. The mitzvah of hashavas aveda, just like the mitzvah of not charging interest, and the mitzvah of not committing ona'ah, if you remember from the beginning, where we talked about ona'ah, which is from the second chapter, of overcharging someone, of exploiting someone's ignorance in commercial trade, only applies to a Jew and does not apply to a non-Jew. If I find a lost object that clearly belongs to a Gentile, I do not have an obligation of hashavas aveda. The obligation of hashavas aveda only applies to Jews. Now, that's not to say that if I find a wallet and it has the guy's name is Christopher McDonald, and so clearly it's not a Jew, right? Does that mean that I should keep the wallet for myself? Well, no, of course not. Anyone's gonna tell you that being a Jew means the opportunity to make a Kiddush Hashem, and therefore, of course, you should try to return the lost object. Call up the guy and tell him, I found your wallet, please come to my home. He'll come and see you with a big yarmulke, and he'll make a big Kiddush Hashem, right? So obviously, whenever you have an opportunity to return lost objects, you should. But is there an obligation? In other words, do you have a halachic obligation to do so? So the answer is no. It's proper to do so because of Kiddush Hashem, but it doesn't have that absolute level of obligatory duty as it does when you're dealing with a Jew. And therefore, if you find a lost object in an area, such as, the Eaton Center downtown, where the majority of the passers-by are not Jewish, so then you don't have to be concerned that an object that you find belongs to a Jew, unless it clearly has markings that it's Jewishly owned, because it has because it's a talus bag you find on the floor or something like that, right? But if you find something that does not have an ID on it, and it is not something that is patently Jewish owned, you are allowed to assume that it fell from a Gentile, and therefore, in a situation where it would create a great burden, and you would have to expend finances to try and find the owner, and even then, let's say it's cash, and you're not sure who it belongs to. Under certain circumstances, you would not have an obligation, let's say, to bring it to, let's say, someone in the shopping center and say, here's some cash that I found. First of all, you never even know if the owner will come to retrieve it, and there may be circumstances where it would be considered to be foolish to return, let's say, loose cash that you find on the floor in a busy thoroughfare. If you return it to the people at the mall, they may just end up pocketing it themselves because the owner may never show up. So there's a lot of gray area in these matters, and it will depend upon how the cash is bundled up. If it's loose cash versus if it's a wad of cash with a specific amount of bills in it, which could be claimed potentially. And if there's an opportunity for a Kiddush Hashem, then perhaps you should still return it or make an attempt to return it. And those are things that we're going to discuss. Okay? And a lot of our discussion is going to revolve around the laws of Yeush, because in many instances, we're going to extend this halacha of lost objects to, am I allowed to take advantage of my friend's property without his knowledge? If he would know, because he's a friend of mine, he wouldn't mind if I took such and such and such, am I allowed to still take it? In other words, the idea of, shalom midas, without the person's knowledge. We're going to get into those halachas as well when we learn this chapter. Under what circumstances am I allowed to take something of my friend's which I know he wouldn't mind if I had, even though he's not aware of it right now? Okay? So, why don't we get started, and we'll learn the standard halacha. So I think I've given you enough information now for us to be able to intelligently understand the following sif in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Haroa Avedas Yisrael. If you see an object that's lost by a fellow Jew, Vinis Ale Mimenu, and you hide from it, which basically means you keep on walking without doing anything, without trying to retrieve it and return it to its owner, over below sase, you violate a negative commandment. Shenemar, lo sir'eh, es shor achicha, o es seyo nidachim, v'hisalam tamehem, that you're not allowed to see your friend's ox or sheep just straying, and you're not allowed to hide from that. So the Torah says you're not allowed to do that. So just by keep on walking and pretend that you didn't see it, you violated a commandment without doing anything. So there are times when you can violate the Torah by inaction instead of action. Of course, this is one of those examples where you pretend that you didn't see it when in reality you did see it. And only Hashem will know whether you are guilty or not. And furthermore, ubitel mitzvah saseh, But beyond just violating the negative commandment, you have also squandered the opportunity to do a positive mitzvah. Shene'emar, hashev tishivein le'achicha, because the Torah afterwards speaks in the positive and says, you shall surely return it to your brother. So that's halacha number one. You violate both a negative commandment and a positive commandment if you walk past a lost object that belongs to a fellow Jew and you do nothing and you make no effort to restore it to him. Case number two is Lakach es ha'aveda la'atzmo bitel mitzvah saseh va'over bebeis lavin. Let's say you do actively, you violate the Torah, and instead of returning the lost object to your fellow, you pick it up and put it in your pocket. You say, hey, I recognize that watch. It belongs to my friend Yaakov, but I'm going to keep that watch because it's a Rolex. So you pick it up and you put it in your pocket, with the intention of keeping it. So in that situation, you have violated a positive commandment of returning it to your friend, and you violated now two negative commandments. Al lo sigzol, va'al lo suchal lihisalem. So you violated, you shall not steal, and you violated, you shall not hide, which was from the previous pasuk, right? Because the Torah says you're not allowed to hide from your obligation, and here you are hiding, you're shirking your obligation by pocketing it for yourself. Okay, now, case number three. Chazar bo, vehishiva liba aleha. Let's say after you picked up the Rolex with the intention of keeping it for yourself, you have remorse. So you put it in your pocket, you come home, and you look at it and you say, what am I doing? Am I crazy? I'm going to pawn this Rolex. My friend Yaakov will never forgive me. I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror. And so you have remorse, and you decide that I'm going to give this back to Yaakov. So, vehishiva liba aleha, you return it to Yaakov, tikein es hakol. So then you've rectified the wrong. Kemo hameshiv es hagzela, just as if you had returned a stolen object. Because essentially what you've done is you stole something, and now you're returning what you stole. Ki lav shel losira v'gomer hu nitek la'aseh shel hashev tishivein, kamo shelav shelot tigzol hu nitek la'aseh shel vehishiv es hagzela. And the reason is because there are certain averos that can be rectified by action. In other words, there are certain averos that can only be rectified through tshuva. So, for example, if I have sinful thoughts, if I have lustful thoughts, if I watch pornography, okay? So how do I do tshuva? I do tshuva because that's between God and myself, and I do vidoy on Yom Kippur, and I confess, and I ask God for forgiveness, and God will forgive me. There are other sins that I can rectify by a simple action. If I steal your widget, how do I rectify the sin? I return to you the widget. By giving you back the widget, I have rectified the sin. Now it's possible that I still have to say vidoy on Yom Kippur to ask for Hashem for forgiveness for having done an act of theft, but nonetheless, the primary rectification is righting the wrong and is giving back the thing. So he basically says that just like when you steal, you right the wrong by returning that which you stole, so too, when you pocket the Rolex that was lost, you right the wrong by returning it to its proper owner. So then he writes, Bamed dvar mamurim, but when is this so? Keshehishiva kodem shenisyashu haba'olim mimena. That's when you return it before Yaakov has given up hope, before he's had Yeush, before he's given up hope of retrieving it. Avolim nisyashu haba'olim mimena. Achar shenot lazeh. But let's say you pocketed the Rolex and you held on to it for a year, and then you decided you're going to be a good guy and return it. So by that point, Yaakov has already given up hope because he lost his Rolex a year ago. He realizes he's never going to see it again, and that Rolex is now ownerless. Hareze me'uvas lo yuchal liskon. So this is a pasuk, by the way, from Koheles that we just read over Sukkos. Me'uvat lo yuchal litkon literally means it's something that is perverse or corrupt that cannot be rectified. In other words, there's permanent damage here that you cannot rectify, because essentially you stole it, and now it's ownerless because Yankel has given up hope of ever retrieving it. So you can't rectify the wrong by just returning it to him. So you can't rectify lo ha'aseh v'lo halavin. You can't rectify the mitzvah of hashavas aveda that you squandered, the positive. You cannot rectify the theft, the stealing, or the hiding that you committed. Lefi shahashavto shahashavaso osa matanahu shenosein leba'alam mishalo. He says, because if after you kept it in your possession for a year, Yankel already had Yeush, so this watch is ownerless now. And an ownerless item you've acquired. It belongs to you. The guy who found it, it belongs to you. It's yours. It's your Rolex. And now you feel that you're doing the right thing by giving it back to Yankel. It doesn't belong to Yankel anymore. At least according to this approach, because he already relinquished ownership of the watch by having Yeush, right? Ki kavar kena'a b'Yeush ba'olim. Because you already acquired it through the Yeush of the owner. Ve'ena dome l'sha'ar motzei aveda lifnei Yeush, shechayev lahachzira afilu achar Yeush, kamo sheyizbar. And he says, and it's different from other cases of where as we're going to go through these halachos, we're going to see that even when you find an object and the owner gives up hope after you find it of ever retrieving it, you still have a mitzvah of hashavas aveda, as we will explain. He says the reason why it's different over here is lefi shekeven shehigbia al das lahachzira liba'aleha v'lolid la'atzmo harezu nasis pikadon biyado uvirshus be'aleha omedes. He says, when I pick up an object that belongs to Yankel with the intention of returning it to him, then the object now is, I'm holding it in my home for Yankel. And therefore it's considered to be in Yankel's possession. And when something's in my possession, regardless of my thoughts about that object, I still retain ownership. If I have a watch, and that watch is in the drawer in my house, and I can't find the watch because I forgot where I put it, so I think that the watch is lost, and I give up hope of retrieving the watch. Does the watch now become ownerless? So halachically, no, because since it's still physically in my possession, it does not become ownerless. Something only becomes ownerless if it's in a public area and I relinquish ownership. It then becomes hefker, becomes ownerless. But in a situation where it's in my drawer and I just can't find it, so then it's not ownerless, even though I've relinquished hope, I've had Yeush. Similarly, if a guy picks up my watch, puts it in his pocket with the intention of returning it to me because he knows that it's Yankel's watch, and he has that in mind, so then when he puts it in his drawer, it's as if he's put it in my drawer. It's as if he's put it in Yankel's drawer. And therefore, even if Yankel gives up hope because he figures, well, I lost it, I'm never going to get it back, it's still owned by Yankel. The watch is not ownerless. Lefichach ein hayeush motzia mirishus ba'olim, shehayeush eino kehefker gamur. He says, and therefore, the fact that Yankel may have given up hope after the guy picked it up does not make it ownerless, because the person who picked it up had the intention of holding it for Yaakov, so it becomes like it's in Yankel's possession. Masha'in kein zeh, shenatlo la'atzmo, v'lo na'ases pikadon biyado, eina etzlo, bo'medes birishus be'aleha, ela kimunachas al gabe karka olam shel hefker. He says, but that's why it's different over here. When this guy maliciously picked up Yankel's Rolex to keep for himself, then it's as if it's still lying on a ground in a public area, because he hasn't taken it for Yankel. It's therefore, if Yankel at that point has Yeush, and a year goes by, so then this object now becomes ownerless. Now we're going to have to hold it here because I lost track of time. But we're going to see that there's a difference of opinion in this halacha by the time we get to the end of the halacha tomorrow. But I want you to keep this in mind, that we're going to review this concept tomorrow, and I hope it's not too complicated. I hope is everyone okay so far with what's going on? Okay, and we're going to translate this into some real life situations, and we'll continue this in your